I just want to begin by sharing that I was watching a video, actually a conversation between a medical professional, and talking about these times and how these times are kind of causing a kind of collective trauma that many of us are experiencing symptoms associated with what could be PTSD. And so as we recognize that these times are so unusual and that we are being emotionally altered by what's going on, we need to take extra special steps with respect to how we take care of ourselves and how we're interacting with the dynamics associated with what's going on in the world, because they can produce effects. If we are experiencing trauma in our life, it's going to affect how we relate to what's happening in our world. And it's going to affect our emotional and mental and physical well-being. And so we should all be taking extra steps to make sure that we're not allowing the conditions and circumstances of the world to adversely modulate us, and especially when it comes to how we are coping with the various challenges that all of us face individually as well as collectively. So in the context of looking at the dynamics of what's happening in this chaotic world and its impact upon us, then the tools that we can bring to settling our nervous system, minimizing the adverse effects of trauma, go a long ways in really helping us be present to what's happening without being diminished by it or overcome by it. And so it's been my effort in the last 2 talks that I've done. This is my 3rd talk now in this series of looking at transformative practices that can assist us in managing what's happening in this world. And as Jane and I realize that as our retirement is impending, we have a finite amount of opportunities to be in relationship with conveying what is our passion, and that is these transformative principles that really work, that really make a difference. And so today I'm wanting to talk about the Q effect, and my talk title is Do the Q. And so this is all about engaging in that deeper work of reconciling those aspects of ourselves that live in the belief that we're less than, or we're not enough, or we're disappointment, or whatever. But the point is that until we actually recognize that we have to take ownership of the dynamics of our own creative process that impact not only the external world, but impact our own personal selves. So I want to begin in this talk by answering the question, what is the Q process? What is the Q process training? And why should you be interested in the Q process and taking the training? And how to do the Q, how to actually have the experience. So as a part of our culture here at Unity Spiritual Center over the last 5.5 years, the Q process has been an integral part of our program of growing the emotional and spiritual maturity of our community. Not that we're immature, but the reality is that we can all benefit by being able to manage our own emotional state without necessarily sourcing our discomfort outside of ourselves, making somebody necessarily the matter with us. So these are advanced skills. As we grow spiritually, we become more and more centered in the awareness that we create our own personal reality, and we have to exercise, we have to differentiate our conditioned self from the dimension of us that is spirit, that is here to make a difference in this world. So what is the Q process? The Q process is a self-directed system of exploring the own depths of a disconnect, as well as the limiting beliefs that constitute the patterns that tend to live us or run us without our permission in our lives. And so as we begin to understand the dynamics associated with the discomforts that we experience in our life, and that they're connected to beliefs that we have about ourselves, we can begin to disentangle from the outer experience of what's happening as it relates to how we are, and recognize that the outer conditions are a mirror is a mirror unto our own way of being. In other words, if we're experiencing some lack in the outer, it's a mirror unto our own sense of not enough or insufficiency. So this is in part how the Q process is set up. It's also in the context of bringing brain science, spiritual principle, and practices to the effort of really transcending our self-imposed limitations. We work with story, we work with unmet needs, we look at authentic action, all the ways in which we can begin to restructure our neural architecture to create different brain maps for how we interact with what's happening out in the world, especially in relationship to triggering moments. So the Q process training is an opportunity to learn the system that is the Q process. So the training itself brings you into an experience of the principles that help a participant understand and begin to work with their own self-system and the circuits of their self-system that perpetuate the patterns of their life. And so in the course of presenting the science and the principles and the research underlying the Q process, participants in the training participate in exercises that help them begin to connect the dots between a triggering moment and uncomfortable feeling and a limiting belief and an earlier experience where they took on a myth or a message or a belief about oneself, and how that pattern replicates itself in our grown-up experience. And so as we begin to understand what's happening in terms of our conditioned self, and as we begin to unpack the dynamic of how we have taken on those self-imposed limitations, we can begin to disentangle from that dynamic. And so the training presents these principles, and included in the training is the 21-day Q process, an opportunity to look at those triggering moments and begin to trace those moments back down to a deeper belief that the little boy or little girl within us is possessing, and then being able to help that part of us repattern or reparent that part of us where we are living in the belief that there's something wrong with us. So the training helps us recognize that part of our God job is to reparent or repattern those ingrained dynamics that keep us locked into a predictable lifestyle. So one of the other ways in which we've often described the Q process, actually this was the name of it in the very beginning, the art and practice of living with nothing and no one against you. I mean, just think about that for a moment. When we put that title out there, we got quite the reaction, because we're not used to thinking about the dynamic of what's happening in our life in any other context other than when it looks or feels against us, it is against us. But when we bring into that kind of conviction the awareness that with practice and through the art, we can live as if nothing and no one is against us. And that produces a cognitive dissonance within our being, because it seems like that's impossible because of all of the evidence that we've gathered over the years. But yet when we realize that there is a way of being in our life without feeling diminished by what's happening in our life, and that requires of us, however, before we can accomplish that capacity to live artfully in the dynamic of life, to have our life always, regardless of how it looks or feels, as if it's for us, as if we've welcomed it into our life, as if we have required of the universe bringing us the perfect situation that enables us to overcome one of those self-imposed limitations. We recognize that there's nothing out there that cannot be used to actually further our unfolding, further our transformation. One of the things that we begin our Q process trainings with the question, how would your life be different if you lived in full integrity in the awareness that nothing and no one is against you? And when we ask this question, it sort of causes a great hush in the room when we do this in person. And as we begin to tease out the possibilities of what might be different about our life if we all of a sudden were not able to have someone or something against us, what would change? And as we think deeply into this possibility, we would discover that we would become less fearful, less anxious, less stressed, but more important, we would be unable to be in certain behaviors that keep us locked in to the stress and to the trauma that we are kind of trying to insulate ourselves from. For instance, if we were living in integrity with the principle that there's nothing and no one against us, it would be impossible to make somebody the matter with us or something the matter with us, right? It would be impossible to react to someone's judgment or criticism because you would know that someone's judgment is not about you, but is for you. It's about what's missing for them or what the relationship needs or about what you might have said or did that created some separation. But in any respects, the judgment is not against us. The judgment is capable of revealing what is missing or broken or not working. And so when we recognize that all of our ways in which we have set up a kind of armor or a coping strategy or a mechanism to keep us from feeling that we're unsafe, all of that would drop away. And all of a sudden we would know that the universe takes care of us, that there are forces and intelligence that surround us, that keep us aligned with spirit, and we would have intuition that would move us in ways to avoid the obstacles and conditions that otherwise, when we're unconscious, when we're driven, when we're living out of our default mode network, we would otherwise fall victim to. And so as we recognize that we have this capacity to imagine a world where we could function free of believing that someone or something could be in our way, we recognize that whatever's in our way is our way. So now I'm going to talk about in more detail and more personal way why the Q process is so integral to our own spiritual transformation. And so I'm wanting to share next an image of myself. This picture was taken in when I was 59 years old, so 11 years ago, I think. 2009. That's 11 years ago. And I'm going to show you a picture. Right now I weigh 145 pounds. I'm going to show you a picture of me, 245 pounds. And I'm going to tell you a story about how I became this person that you now see before you. So here I am, obese and unhealthy, and I have been to the doctor, and the doctor has tripled my blood pressure medicine and the statins I've taken for my high cholesterol. And the picture on the right is as Jane and I are in Melbourne, Australia, in 2009 Parliament of World Religions. And we're just coming back to America, and we both work at the Association of Unity Churches Home Office, Unity Worldwide Ministries, and I was one of the individuals among. We had a staff of 42 at the time, and I believe they reduced the staff to about 20. And so I was one of the casualties of that downsizing. And so here I am, 100 pounds heavier than I am now, having been released, and then given all this time, I could have gone the route of having all this against me, but because the Q process was beginning to emerge in our consciousness, I decided to use the experience of having no job to really work on myself. And so, but what I'm wanting to share that really is integral to you understanding what's behind this effort is that I had a lot of shame about who I was, because there was a time in my life when I was not like this. And there was a time in my life when I was very healthy, very athletic, that I was a model for what it looked like to be in integrity and on the spiritual path as a minister. And so when I was in ministry in Fayetteville, Arkansas, I had a martial arts school, and it was called Olympic Karate Academy. And I would also have the church there in Fayetteville, and my karate school was larger than my church. I had the largest karate for kids program in Northwest Arkansas. And it was a part of my identity, a part of who I was. And I was lean and mean, and I was healthy, and I was having fun. The two kids on the right are my son and daughter. That's Quarter. You might have seen him at a musical that we had last year, and my daughter Julie. Well, the point is that being heavy and overweight was a kind of conflict for my identity being embedded in the athlete within me, a person who was filled with energy. And here I was, having got this way, having left ministry in Fayetteville, Arkansas, to work for Unity Worldwide Ministry as Director of Peacemaking Services, and then later as the Vice President of Integral Operations. I became a part of the corporate dynamic of our denomination. I had an office where I would sit in the office. Prior to that, before moving to Unity Village to assume those roles, I taught 22 hours of martial art classes a week, going to no martial art classes a week. And so over the course of a short period of time, I gained quite a bit of weight. What's more is I resolved myself to being overweight. And if you've ever been overweight, there is a part of one's effort to recover from that, the part of us that has resolved being this way, because it's just who we are. And so I would try to lose weight like everybody tries to lose weight. I would be so uncomfortable I couldn't even bend down. And so exercise was a challenge for me. And if you've ever sought to lose weight, you know you begin with an a sense of urgency and earnestness about that effort. And so did I. And so I made a commitment to deal with my obesity. And so I purchased some exercise equipment. Actually, Jane and I had a room in our house that was our exercise room. We'd have a weight machine, and Jane would have her treadmill and her bike, and then I'd have my elliptical. But after a while, I realized that I was going to have to use the elliptical to actually start losing weight. So that became my effort. But after a while, I found myself looking for excuses to kind of stop. And that's another thing to observe, is that when you're in a kind of desperate kind of downward spiral, there's a part of you that knows that you're going to self-sabotage yourself, regardless of how much effort you put into that. And I later discovered that part of me that was self-sabotage was the belief that I was a disappointment. So every time I would try to lose weight, I would quit, and therefore I'd feel a sense of shame and disappointment about myself, and then that would reinforce the belief that I am a disappointment. That's the kind of vicious cycle that we're in. But after I was able to recognize, after I got off that elliptical and decided I can't do this anymore, I heard a voice. And it was the voice of my father. And I heard that voice, and it said to me, "Gary, you never finish anything." And it was such an illuminating moment, because I recognized in that moment I found myself visualizing and seeing I was jogging with my father and not able to keep up with him. My father was a San Francisco police officer. He was an athlete himself, member of the San Francisco Yacht Club. He would routinely swim the San Francisco Bay. And so little Gary would be having a difficult time keeping up with his dad. And so when I finally found I was unable to keep up and stopped, I heard his voice, and he said, "Gary, you never finish anything." And so I also saw in that moment, I took on the belief that I'm a disappointment. And here's evidence. My dad tells me that I never finish anything. And so I've let my dad down, and so here I have taken on this belief that I'm a disappointment. And when you have a belief that you are a disappointment, your behavior disguises that belief, and you become acutely focused on making sure that no one's disappointed. And what happens when you become so hypervigilant not to disappoint anybody? You become a people pleaser. You become committed to making sure everybody's need is met to the detriment of your own because you don't want to disappoint anybody. Well, the reality is that in the recognition that I took on that belief in that moment, and as I reflect upon how that belief that I'm a disappointment has lived itself through all of my life, through all of the marriages, through all the relationships in my professional work as a minister. I left pulpit ministry because I couldn't manage being any more a disappointment, because I would find myself inadvertently letting people in my church down because of that belief. Well, it wasn't long after that I recognized that as a parent, there have been times when I have seen that I have said something, I have said words to my children that have created and planted in them the belief that they are a disappointment. And I saw that as a father, had I had the opportunity to take back a message that would etch into my son or my daughter's psyche the belief that they don't measure up, that they're not enough. I saw that as a parent, every parent would want to take that back. Every parent would, if they knew what could happen, would want to rectify that. And I knew that if my father had known that I would take on a belief just because of those very words that became then my identity, my false identity, my separate self's identity. If my dad would have known that, he would have had a different message when he saw little Gary not keeping up with him. Can you not see how that would be so? And so I began to imagine what that different message might be from my father. And so I imagined and gave voice to my father in relationship to little Gary in that impressionable moment when he's so tired he can't keep up. And I heard my dad say to little Gary, he said, Gary, I'm so pleased that you're wanting to be like me, that you're trying to keep up with me, but what would make my heart feel more proud, more full, and appreciate so much more is for you to find your passion, for you not to feel like you need to keep up with me, but for you to find what's important for you, and for you to create what is your gift, your passion. And as I filled myself in that awareness, I began to see what that disappointment was connected to, and I allowed that disappointment to melt away. And so in that moment, I was able to differentiate the discomfort of having a belief that I let my father down that was superimposed upon the discomfort of the exercising moment. I was able to see that if I resolved the discomfort of believing that I was a disappointment, I could be in the discomfort of the exercise and not feel that I had to quit. And so there came a time when I had to kind of be in that experience of, okay, here I am. The moment that I took on this belief is when I failed to keep up with my dad. When I got to a place where I recognized that I no longer had to keep up with my dad, my authentic action to deal with my obesity was to run. And I heard the voice, "Run, Forrest, run!" and I literally ran my ass off around Unity Village Lake, 3,000 miles in 6 months, 2 hours, 3 times a day. And I had removed myself from visibility with my colleagues, and I went to a national convention the following year, having lost 100 pounds, and people could not believe what they saw. And the CEO of Unity Worldwide Ministries at the time, Reverend James Trapp, saw me coming out of my car. He was coming out of Unity Village Bookstore, and he saw me for the first time after having lost this weight, and he looked at me and he said, "Gary, you can do anything." And I never forgot that, his words, but it translated into an affirmation that once we're able to really disentangle from the limiting belief and the conditions that planted it there and recognize that that's not the truth of us, when we reach that realization, we discover that we can do anything that we set our mind to. And that was such a powerful experience. And in the course of being able to kind of model and demonstrate what is possible, when you do the internal reconciliation, the outer experience begins to manifest itself effortlessly. And so Jane would be on many of those runs and walks with me around Unity Village, and in our effort to kind of really be seeing that our experience is really an opportunity for us to begin to document some of the ways in which we have basically lifted ourselves up by our own bootstraps, so to speak. The Q process became evidence that the Q process became something a tool that I became able to utilize as a transformative experience. So I'm kind of struggling now to kind of wrap the talk up. The dynamic here is that there is a new message as we are beginning to recognize that whenever we are kind of aware of being connected to a dynamic within ourselves that otherwise is us pushing life away, it's connected to the little boy or little girl in us that is living in a message or in a belief that they're not enough. But I was able to reparent little Gary by giving my father a different voice, and therefore little Gary receiving a message that enabled little Gary from that moment on my timeline to be able to manifest in my present moment a weight loss, a fantastic demonstration. So the work that we do with our younger self that seems to be gone, but no, still lives within us in terms of our neuroarchitecture, our belief system, the moment that we free ourselves by virtue of a current situation, a present moment trigger, and when we take it back to that little boy or little girl in us, the moment that we reparent that message within ourselves, something in our present moment in the outer will manifest in a totally different, profound way. And we recognize this phenomenon in the context of energetic healing. And so this is an opportunity for those of you in this spiritual community, if you're called to really deepen your spiritual practice and looking at a way in which not only can you resolve your own internal distress with respect to what's happening in the world, but that by virtue of you just repatterning your own internal timeline, you can begin to transform the outer world in which we live. All right, so the Q effect, I hadn't mentioned about the Q effect, is the organizational structure that within which the Q process and our work with transforming people's lives happens. So the Q effect is a business that Jane and I and our business partner have created. In the last 10 years, over 8,000 people worldwide have been through the Q process. Over 140 facilitators or Q coaches throughout the world have been certified and trained. And now the Q process is an elective in the ministerial program, and it's being taught in centers, New Thought, CSL, and Unity all over the world. And in our culture, in Unity Spiritual Center, has been a part of our tradition ever since Jane and I have been here. And in the course of the 5.5 years, hundreds of people have been through the Q process, and it'll continue to be an important integral component of what brings people into alignment with the culture of this ministry. Imagine the entire church, people having the capacity to not be diminished by what's happening, but rather empowered to really connect up with that part of themselves that they can really bring forth that compassion and love and that vision of all things working together for a greater good. That's what's possible, and the Q process is a partner in that effort. So the how to do the Q is next. Amber is going to be conducting online training. Amber has been through the Q coach training, and she's going to do an excellent job. We're excited about her facilitating this. Now, in order for you to get into the class, you have to register and fill out the registration form, and then you have to order the Q Process workbook. It has to be mailed to you, so there's a time issue involved. So I mail these things out. You go to theqeffect.com to purchase your Q Process workbook, but you'll get that information from the registration process. So follow the registration process, sign up, and you'll get information as to how to acquire the Q Process workbook. So I'm going to close my sharing with a short video, 2 minutes, 12 seconds, on a testimony as to the Q Process. Jane and I last month did a Q Process online workshop for the Unity of Houston, one of our largest churches in the New Thought movement. And several of their ministerial staff were involved in it, and so this is their thoughts as to its value.
This has been a really kind of a life-changing process for me, and I find myself more and more when anything happens and I sense that level of stress start to go up, immediately my brain is kicking into gear and going, you're not on your cue card, you need to get back on your cue card. And I'm able to just kind of take a breath. And so for me, it's just this big shift, and it has really reduced my stress level and made me realize how much of that stress wasn't about what was going on around me, but was about what I was internalizing regarding what was going on around me.
That there has been so much healing that has happened for me in the last 3 weeks doing this. Amazed at how these memories come up of things that I didn't think were such big moments in my life. So I'm in awe of this process and inspired to keep going with it, because it's powerful and does things in ways that other work I've done doesn't. So thank you so much, Jane and Gary.
So Addicts with Jane Marie said, this is going to be part of my life. I've had Zoom calls. They just announced layoffs, and I automatically did a sheet in my head, like, so I could like stay calm and collective and actually take in the information I was receiving. So this has been one of the better experiences I've had as far as my spiritual journey. I just see how you can really apply it, and if you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you can enrich relationships you have with people.
But for me, I think the most powerful takeaway comes from a kind of aphorism that you gave us last week, Jane, in saying that pain not transformed is transmitted. And I am so acutely aware of healing this in myself so that I do not give this to my son as an inheritance. And I found it to be really, really transformative. And for me, the reason I know how effective it is because of how uncomfortable and unpleasant it has been for most of this week for me.
So, the reason we talk about the Q so much is because we believe in it, and because I'll say personally that I have found such liberation from these things that, I've been on the spiritual path for decades, and this has helped me move beyond where I was in such a big way, and to recognize when those patterns from the past are starting to, seep into my present moment. That pain not transformed is pain transmitted. That's a Richard Rohr piece of wisdom. And it's true that if I have something from my past that has not been worked with, that it's still alive for me, even though it's underground, it will just wreak havoc with my life to the point where I'm 100 pounds overweight and I can't change it. If you've ever been in that place where you just feel like this is it, I can't fix this. No matter what I try, it keeps on happening. And so that whole idea of, if we have an affirmation and we have at the same time the belief in the opposite that's underground, that belief is going to win. we won't change our lives until we deal with that mistaken belief. And so much of it comes from our early years, before we're even pre-verbal. We don't even know that we've made these decisions about ourselves and our lives and the world. And for me, the world, for all about transformation, it just we have to do that internal work first if we want to see it in the world out there. And so I'm always moved very emotionally when you're telling the story about your weight loss, because, as you said, I was kind of running along beside you there, and it made my heart happy when you were so successful and really dug down and found this is the reason right here. I've been carrying this idea around that I don't finish anything and that I'm a disappointment. And it's showing up in this way.
Well, during that time, that was when The Biggest Loser was coming out.
Oh yeah, The Biggest, yeah.
And so I would watch The Biggest Loser and be crying and bawling with all the other people, about all the issues that was about underlying their weight, and yeah, it was quite the journey. Now I remember gaining some weight back. Actually, I got down to really low, and then I got back up, to about 175, which is not overweight for me, but it's way more than my body needs. And so as soon as I saw that, oh, well, what's going on now? And I realized that I hadn't recreated my identity. I resolved the discomfort that enabled me to go through the exercise and the weight loss, but I didn't change my identity. And so that was the next level. I had to use the Q process to really shift out of this belief that I am what I eat, or I'm going to use food as if I'm going to use it to medicate myself, or I had trained after I lost the weight. My body wanted to have a whole different way of eating and being fed, and I finally whipped my body back into submission after a while. But that's when I gained the weight back, and so I had to recognize that my body wanted to have a different mind to feed it than what I was bringing to it. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think of the Eckhart Tolle saying that whatever's happening in your world, I'm paraphrasing here, act as if you chose it and welcome it. And that it's the words "as if" that I think that's why the Q process it works. Living as if nothing and no one was against us is a way for us to mine the gold from this. Because that moment with your father, it took decades for it to be for you.
Yeah.
So we can start to look at all of our past and through those eyes.
Yep,
but there's
absolutely.
something here that can really bless me if I do this healing work.
Yeah.